Joined now by Vicki McKenna for our weekly Culture Cast. Vicki, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Duke.
Weird to not see you in camo. You look good, though. Let's talk today about a kind of a serious
Next time
issue.
I won't disappoint.
Yeah, that's right. It is hunting season, after all. Let's take a look at what's going on in Waukesha, Wisconsin, right down the road from both of us. And we have a situation where Joe Biden came out the other day. Jen Psaki was asked, is Biden going to come to Waukesha, given how many little children were murdered by a thug this close to Christmas? And of course, they said, you won't believe it, it was a little too expensive to fly around the country this time of year. So he's not coming. And this got you and me thinking, it's an interesting world we live in America 2021, where some crimes that are serious crimes are being treated as non-crimes. And non-crimes now, depending upon your race or your gender or your politics, some crimes that aren't crimes at all are ending with people in jail. Let's talk about that issue.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way to put it. And so, number one, I think the people of Waukesha are probably grateful that Joe Biden isn't going to come and try to stage some photo op. Number two, his mental acuity has been so substantially reduced that may suffice as a reason why he wouldn't make the trip. But I think the real reason is because Darrell Brooks, the suspect in the Waukesha massacre that resulted in the death of 6 people, including an 8-year-old boy, and injured at least 48 other people by deliberately careening through a parade to take out as many people as possible, was somebody who is a exemplar of bail reform. He is someone, now we don't have explicit bail reform here in Wisconsin, but we have functional bail reform from Soros-funded DAs who have decided that if you're an oppressed category, then you deserve to have insanely low bail. And so I don't think Joe Biden wanted to have to take responsibility for Darrell Brooks, given that Darrell Brooks is a career thug with multiple violent felonies who was let out on a $500 bail, which permitted him to be free to get into a vehicle and kill all of those people in Waukesha. I don't think Joe Biden liked those optics very much. And so he's staying away. And if they stay away, the media stays away. And if the media stays away from this case, then they can pretend that it didn't happen and instead fixate on things like the Rittenhouse trial in Kenosha or an officer-involved shooting. This one's a little bit harder for them to explain, isn't it?
Well, it is. Talking about that double standard, think about the Charlottesville nonsense where you had one driver driving into a crowd, nothing like the carnage we see here. They're still talking about that. They're still using that as, Trump-sponsored domestic terrorism against his own country.
Trump-sponsored white supremacy domestic terrorism that, of course, then was used to label half of the entire country. And you're exactly right. There was months and months and months of attention paid to that. Now, here you've got Darrell Brooks, who has posted black supremacist rantings on his social media, anti-white, hyper-racist rantings, anti-Trump, was railing about the Rittenhouse trial. We don't pay any attention to that. In fact, you've seen the press. They're not even saying a human being got behind the wheel of a car. They're saying the car did it. They're not talking about his record. They're not talking about bail reform. They're not talking about $500 in bail. They're not talking about Josh Kaul, the Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin, sending a state prosecutor to argue on behalf of low bail for a career violent thug who has got a 25-year record like Darrell Brooks. They're not talking about that at all. But you're exactly right. They're still finding reasons to talk about the guy who crashed into the crowd because he was a Trump supporter and a racist.
Well, and, talk a little bit before we come to the break. It really is remarkable how the media seems to already have memory hold Waukesha. I mean, it had its media run, and then unlike these other stories that lingered on for years, we're pretty much past it now.
It's gone. It's off splash pages. It's off front pages. It is no longer being carried in any media that isn't immediately accessible to the people of Wisconsin. So yeah, for all intents and purposes, Waukesha is a thing in the past, and we're not going to talk about it. Just like that Texas school shooting from a couple of months ago where the young black student attacks people, including a teacher and a pregnant woman in his school, released on signature bond. We haven't heard a thing about that particular school shooting. A school shooter's let out on his own signature. But of course, he checked the right boxes. He was an oppressed perpetrator, which meant he was a victim.
Yeah, I want to pick that up after the break. Let's talk more about this because there's a lot more examples besides just Waukesha of how crimes now that are serious felonies are being ignored and non-crimes are getting people in jail. I'll talk to you right after the break. Back again with Vicki McKenna for the second part of our Culture Cast. Great talk in the first part about how in Waukesha, for instance, Wisconsin, the terrible tragedy there, all the ways that progressives tried to minimize and ignore, the media ignore that tragedy because, you know, the victim, the perpetrator happened to be African American, so it's not a real crime, apparently. Meanwhile,
Right.
you left us at the end of the last moment talking about what happened in Texas. In Texas, you had an African American young student. He was allowed out of jail the next day with a simple signature bond, and you've not heard a single thing about this case since then. We also had a shooting yesterday in Michigan, which didn't follow the typical pattern of white boy killings, right? If typical white boy shoots up a school for 24/7 around the clock, the anti-gun movement has this all over the media. We've heard nothing since the shooting.
It's a tell because this is a story coming out of northern Michigan that is tailor-made to have, hyperbolic, breathless, 24/7 coverage by at least cable news and at least the political Twitter sphere. So that's a tell. I don't know the details of the Michigan story because there are very few details to share, and there are very, very few details that have been shared about it. But yeah, that's one to watch because when the media isn't hyping a school shooting, there's something that the media doesn't want to call attention to. It's the reason why they're not hyping Waukesha. They don't want to call attention to the fact that Darrell Brooks, a longtime career thug, violent thug, was the recipient of conceptually, at least philosophically, the idea of bail reform, having had liberal prosecutors argue on behalf of very low bail. Now, contrast this with Kyle Rittenhouse, who acted in self-defense, was found by a jury to have acted in self-defense, was held on $2 million bail. $2 million. He had to raise $2 million to bail himself out. He wasn't a flight risk. And he had acted in self-defense, and there was abundant video proving to the prosecutors within the first 18 hours of the Kenosha riots involving the shootings with Kyle Rittenhouse that was self-defense. And there was also indication he would not flee. He had family in the city of Kenosha, but he was held on a $2 million bail. That's weird, huh? And then there are people who didn't commit crimes at all who were held without bail and in solitary confinement in a DC jail. Those are a number of the January 6th protesters, most of whom did not commit acts of violence, did not break any windows, did not vandalize any offices. What they did was walk through open doors while Capitol Police essentially watched them do it calmly. And many of them still being held without bail in advance of their trial, which are expected to be in spring of 2022 for nonviolent offenses. Meanwhile, Darrell Brooks gets to go home on $500.
Yeah, and the other glaring example of this that I can't imagine if the shoe was on the other foot, you have these flash mobs of almost exclusively African-American kids. They seem to be young people and teenagers and young adults who are storming these stores, these box stores, these incredibly expensive places, these purse stores. I mean, it's really remarkable. And nobody on the left seems the least bit bothered by this. I can't think of a single serious leftist politician who's even condemning this. It's as if this is reparations in America. Those stores should be grateful because they're helping repatriate and to provide resources for people who have been marginalized.
You saw was it the Chicago Tribune, I think it was some months ago, a column, perhaps it wasn't the Chicago Tribune, but it was a column that declared that looting is in fact reparations. And looting isn't looting now. Looting is organized mass theft or disorganized mass theft. What it is an act of revolution, Duke. And you and I have talked about this before, that crime, as long as it's committed by people who are of approved oppressed classes, crime is actually an act of revolution. It's an act striking against the oppressive white supremacist culture. And so hence the argument for bail reform. Because if it's a Black person or an Hispanic person committing the crime and they check the appropriate boxes, we can contort ourselves into believing that somehow this is just an act of revolution and we should encourage it, which is why you saw riots redefined as mostly peaceful protests. Don't call looting looting. It is unorganized or organized mass theft or it is reparations, and you're not supposed to demand any kind of accountability of the people who are engaged in this violence. By the way, it's not just theft. There was a security guard who was killed because he was protecting a news crew filming the looting. So this has actually also risen already to the level of deadly violence, just like the riots had. But again, the press isn't interested in talking about any of this. They don't cover it at all, any more than they cover what's going on at the border, or they're covering the injustices of the people who are being held in the D.C. jail without bail.